Will the people roaming the planet 300 years from now think kindly of you? Will they send you a thank you card? Or will they seek out your grave so they can spit on it?
I'm thinking they'll rate me as being somewhere in the middle.
Oh, that's just a little too safe. But we'll explore this deep philosophical question next on GrowthBusters.
Calling, 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 calling. Call the GrowthBusters. Whoa, whoa, whoa.
Welcome to the GrowthBusters podcast. Here's where we discuss our society's addiction to growth, and we do our best to chart a sustainable course for human civilization. Why? Because we've got a planet to save. Hi, I'm Dave Gardner, director of the documentary GrowthBusters Hooked on Growth, and tireless crusader for shifting from a culture of growth to a culture of enough.
And I'm Erika Arias, co-host of the GrowthBusters podcast. For the latest on our culture's unsustainable love affair with growth and what we can do about it, visit growthbusters.org.
Well, Erika, it's been too long since we've recorded an episode. I'm glad to get back together in the studio with you.
Same.
Virtual, though it is.
Right.
Got an email that I want to share. This came from Mark. Mark wrote, "Hello, Dave and Erika. I just got around to listening to your podcast with Michael Hall. Beautiful interview. He's thoughtful, with an upbeat attitude, and gave me plenty to think about." Now, what is he writing about? Episode 50 of the GrowthBusters podcast, which was taking a vacation from carbon emissions. You remember that one, don't you, Erika?
I sure do. Michael Hall.
Yeah.
Shout out to you.
Sharp guy, fun conversation. Continuing this email from Mark, he had more to say. Bravo to Erika for going car-free. My wife and I are car-free for 25 years, and including when we stay in Los Angeles with family. And I dare the police to give me a jaywalking ticket for crossing those wide streets slowly. Down with plastic water bottles.
Wow. Awesome. 25 years car-free. Go, Mark. And Mark's wife. That's awesome. Where do they come from?
I think they live somewhere in California, but I can't recall where. So I really wanted to share that, especially since you got a shout out for being car-free, because you need all of the approval and applause you can get for doing that. In Southern California, especially.
In normal circumstances, yes, I would strongly agree with that. I can't take all the credit, though. This pandemic has really made it a lot easier for me to go car-free. And also, shout out to my housemates. We live in a beautiful home very close to the market, which is honestly the only place I really need to walk to get food. But thank you to all of our listeners for writing. Thank you to Mark and Mark's wife for being car-free, and for everybody supporting the GrowthBusters podcast. Please don't forget to send your questions and comments to us at podcast@growthbusters.org.
Well, Erika, before we get into this deep philosophical conversation, which I'm really looking forward to with the author of a book called The Good Ancestor, Roman Krasnarek. Before we get into that, one news item I want to share with you. It's actually an email, but this is the news I want to share. It was in my inbox just a few days ago, and it came from Environment Colorado. And what they wanted me to know was that clear-cut trees are no longer sheltering wolves, caribou, elk, and birds from across North America. They're no longer absorbing carbon and helping to regulate our climate. Instead, they're being pulped to create extra soft tissues and toilet paper. Ooh. Did you know that?
I did not.
It's pretty logical to assume that.
And who's supplying this toilet paper?
Well, I think it's the big brands like Northern and Charmin and the manufacturers. But Environment Colorado has a bone to pick with some of the retailers. And in fact, this email was encouraging me to go sign a petition demanding that Costco stop selling this extra soft toilet paper and just sell, recycled toilet paper or toilet paper made from bamboo, that kind of stuff. And I just wanted to bring it up and see what you think about this, Erika. I found myself thinking, well, yeah, that's certainly worth a shot, but it's interesting that nowhere in this email and nowhere in the petition, there's not a word about advice or a request to make sure that I am voting with my pocketbook, that I am doing my part, which would be not to be buying the extra soft toilet paper from Costco. The only thing I have to do is, click and sign a petition. I don't have to take any individual responsibility for my own action.
Right. Because if you take it away from everybody, it being an option, at least for everybody who shops at Costco, then all of those people will be forced to buy whatever is available. But what about all of the other retailers that do supply that toilet paper?
Yeah. And I found myself thinking about that. Sure, especially if you don't have very much faith in your fellow man, it seems like the most effective thing to do is get that stuff off the shelves so that people don't have a choice.
That's why we don't have sweets in my house.
There you go. But, Costco wouldn't sell it if we didn't buy it. So we have the power. We could stop Costco from selling it just by discontinuing to purchase it. You have the power to do that. You multiplied by a few million, you and the millions of others consumers out there, you choose whether to have a car and fill it up with gas or not. You choose whether to get on an airplane or not. You choose what kind of toilet paper you use.
And I think that's something that just needs to be said again and again. I don't think we hear that enough. And that's why this episode is especially exciting to me, because our guest today, Roman Krznaric, speaks a little bit about that and how individual action really does matter. And it seems like an uphill battle with ourselves. Like, no, selling my car wasn't easy to do. I would love to drive to the beach every weekend like I used to, but it takes a little bit of internal willpower to be able to say, well, the option's there, it's available, but I'm not going to do it. And it's just a matter of doing that over and over again on a daily basis to where it becomes habit and it becomes eventually enjoyable, like our other friend, Joshua Spodek, likes to tell us.
Yeah.
Shout out to Josh.
Yeah. But in just another minute, if you'll indulge me, I want to talk about toilet paper for one more minute.
Oh, mine's in the gutter.
Well, there's a couple of interesting things. One is, did you know that there is such a thing as reusable toilet paper?
I did not. Is this like cloth diapers for babies?
Yeah, kind of like that you put in the washing machine so you're not chopping down new trees constantly to keep yourself in toilet paper. So that's interesting. Seems a little disgusting, but you might want to check it out. I hope I saved the link. We'll put a link in the show notes to wherever it was that I saw that note. You might find that amusing. And then one more thing is, I'm pretty particular about my toilet paper. I hate finding really cheap breakthrough toilet paper, in the public restroom somewhere where, you've got to fold it 25 times, in order to keep it from just completely disintegrating in use. Yeah.
Defeating the purpose of saving, right?
Exactly. I really am a little bit picky about that. But my wife and I were purchasing a little bit of toilet paper the other day, and we had been having a conversation in the household about recycling. Because, recycling doesn't come anywhere close to being enough to save the planet. If you think you're being green because you recycle, well, there's so many other things that you need to add to it. But I think that it's the easiest thing to do. And so if you're not willing to do that, that's so easy, then my gosh, there's no hope for you. So we looked in the toilet paper aisle and we thought, let's see what our options are, and let's try to make sure we get something that's completely recyclable and see what we think. And so we bought Simple Truth recycled toilet paper. And it said on the package that it was stronger and softer. I was a little bit skeptical. I figured, there's going to be a price to pay for being green here. But you know what? Pretty fine toilet paper.
Wow. Okay, this is Dave's quality assurance report on toilet paper. Fantastic. Link in the show notes.
So maybe we can start selling ads,
The sustainable way for your tush.
This is a totally unpaid endorsement. So, yeah, Joshua would be glad to know. So there's the joy of purchasing responsibly in the toilet paper department.
What is your take on, what do you call them? The duvet? Is that what you call it?
Oh, yeah, I used to wonder what the heck that was all about, but now I think it makes a lot of sense, That's one good way to avoid having to use reusable or any kind of toilet paper, I think. And, Colin Bevan, the journalist who wrote No Impact Man, about the year he and his family in the middle of Manhattan tried to shrink their footprint to almost zero. And so he insisted that no toilet paper be used. And his solution was they had a spray bottle of water, and you would spray yourself with this bottle. Well, have you ever tried to do that while you're sitting on the john?
No.
It's not easy. So I think a bidet is a more elegant solution to that one. Well, anything else, or should we get on with the philosophy discussion?
I think now is a good time to move on with the philosophy talk we have today. Roman Krznaric is a public philosopher who writes about the power of ideas to change society. His latest book, The Good Ancestor, How to Think Long-Term in a Short-Term World, has been described by YouTube's The Edge as the book our children's children will thank us for reading. His previous books, including Empathy, The Wonder Box, and Carpe Diem, Regained, have been published in more than 20 languages. Roman is the founder of the world's first empathy museum and is also a research fellow of the Long Now Foundation. Welcome to the GrowthBusters podcast, Roman.
Thank you for having me on. I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
We're very excited to have this conversation too, so thanks for taking time.
Okay, so I think for anybody who hasn't read the book, the concept of short-termism, I think, is just something that we should start with. How would you define that, just for our listeners who aren't familiar or who haven't read the book?
Well, it's really hard to define short-termism, and anyway, isn't it? I think we feel completely straitjacketed in it in all sorts of ways. It's all those drivers which keep us in the here and now, whether it's digital distraction, the way we're clicking the buy now button, or in politics, there's the fact that our politicians can't see past the next election or even the latest tweet, or our businesses can't see past the quarterly report, and nations sit around international conference tables bickering away while the planet burns and species disappear. You know, this is the age of the tyranny of the now. But what counts as short term is different in different realms. You know, for a politician, you know, maybe it is the next tweet or the next headline. If you're on the stock market, it's the nanosecond speed share trading. But I think we all, I guess, intuitively know that we need more long-term thinking to deal with the challenges of our century. You know, we need it to deal with the next pandemic that might be on the horizon. We need it to deal with threats from technologies like artificial intelligence or bioweapons. We need it to deal with racial injustice, which gets passed on from generation to generation. And of course, we need it to deal with the threat of ecological collapse, you know, climate change, biodiversity loss, ocean acidification, all those planetary boundaries that which we are shooting over. So, you know, I think short-termism, it drives me crazy. You know, every time I pick up the newspaper and says, oh, we're too short-term, we need more long-term thinking. Well, what the hell is long-term thinking? How long should it be? Are there different kinds? Is it always good for us? That's the kind of stuff that's really motivated me to write this book.
I thought that people like you and Erika and me had some kind of a genetic defect that made us think long-term, and that most of the human population out there doesn't have that chromosome or something like that. But you sound a little bit more optimistic about everybody having it and just not tapping it.
Well, that's really interesting, because the other day I was actually speaking to one of Britain's most famous cosmologists, an astronomer called Lord Martin Rees. Now, this is a guy who just naturally thinks on the scale of billions of years. His brain is just wired to imagine to the death of the sun in 5 or 6 billion years' time, and to the beginning of the earth. And someone like him, the concept of like deep time, which I talk about in my book, is he can almost sort of touch it, you know, that sense that we are just an eye blink in the cosmic story. Now, if you show me a bunch of geological tables with the Cretaceous and the Jurassic written on it, they do nothing for me. But even though I think a lot of us find it hard to think really long term, I think we do it naturally in so many ways. In a sense, there's a constant tug of war going on in most of our minds between drivers of short and long termism. You know, do I party today or save for my pension for tomorrow? Do I upgrade to the latest iPhone or plant a seed in the ground for posterity? And what that's actually telling us is something really fundamental. That, you know, a lot of us think that we're a pretty short-term species. You know, we're always clicking the buy now button and swiping away, but actually we have this capacity for the long-term imagination. And I call it the difference between the marshmallow brain and the acorn brain. So the marshmallow brain is that part of our neuroanatomy which focuses on immediate rewards and instant gratification. And of course, it's named after that famous marshmallow psychology test from the 1960s, where a marshmallow was put in front of kids on a table, and if they could resist eating it for 15 minutes, they were rewarded with a second marshmallow, and the majority of kids couldn't resist it and gobbled up the snack. But we also have this other part of our brains, and the marshmallow brain, by the way, is really ancient. Like, we share it with rats. It's 80 million years old. But the other part of our brain is the acorn brain, which is all about long-term thinking and planning and strategizing. Like, you plant a seed in the ground, you may never see that oak tree mature in your lifetime. And that part of the brain lives in what's called the frontal lobe, just above our eyes. And if you care to know something more precise, it's actually a bit called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, if you're into neuroscience. But that's the bit which enables us to think long. And, other creatures can think long term a bit. Like a chimpanzee will get a stick, strip off the leaves and turn it into a tool to poke into a termite hole. But they'll never make a dozen of those tools and set them aside for next week, right? But that is exactly what a human being will do. That's why we do save for our kids' educations or write song lists for our own funerals. That's the Acorn Brain in action, which made us, build the Great Wall of China and voyage into space. So we've got this capacity for the temporal pirouette. Our minds can dance across time. The thing is, we're not very good at putting that into practice, right? We are, looking at our phones all the time. Most of our institutions, economic, political, cultural, are not geared towards switching on that acorn brain. That is the challenge.
So is it just a matter of reminding ourselves that we can do it to sort of motivate us to actually save for the future or just be better ancestors?
That's a good question, actually, because I think for some people, it literally is just to know that story, that different narrative about human nature is a motivation in itself. I can talk to people about the acorn brain and think, hey, wow, yeah, of course I can think long term. And that just sort of motivates them itself. But actually, I think most of us need more to switch on our acorn brains. And I think that really depends on who you are. Some people, and I think this is quite a lot of people, that what really gets them to think long term is not me talking to them about the acorn brain and the neuroscience of long term thinking, but actually talking about something much more personal, which is about the connection with their kids or their grandkids or children in their lives, nephews, nieces. I can sit and imagine my daughter, right? She's 12. Now, she could easily be alive in the year 2100, right? When she's 92, she'll be. And I can imagine her on that 92nd birthday. And I think to myself, well, what kind of world is it out the window when she looks out the window? Is it a world of utopia and self-driving cars and everybody happy, or is it a world on fire, right? But what it means is that future is not science fiction. It's an intimate family fact, just, one or two steps away from my own. I mean, if she has children, they could easily be alive into the 22nd century. And when I do that little bit of legacy thinking about that connection through the generations, I find it quite profound because I realize, like, my daughter, she's not sort of floating alone in space. She is part of a web of human relationships, the people that support her, community, work colleagues, family, but also the web of the living world, the air she breathes and the water she drinks. So if I care about her life, well, it's just a logical next step to care about all life, right? Everything that she's part of. So in terms of switching on the acorn brain, as it were, helping us think long term, that is one way. Help putting yourself on those little imaginative journeys, connecting with people who will live into the future. I mean, most of my daughter's life is going to be lived after 2050, and that's quite a profound thought.
Is it easier to do legacy thinking if you have your own child? Is it a lot harder for people who don't have children and would be thinking about the well-being of other people's children in the future?
To be honest, I don't know the answer to that question, but I know actually there's a guy called Rupert Reed in the UK who is a radical Extinction Rebellion activist, and he's just written a book called Parents for a Future. And he's not a parent himself, yet he feels motivated just knowing that there are going to be tens of billions of people who are going to be born on the earth in the next couple of centuries. They far outweigh everyone who's alive today. So I think some people can be motivated just by that very thought, a kind of a weighing up of the scales. This is sort of the essence of utilitarian philosophy, just knowing that who are we to wreak such havoc in just a couple of 100 years when there will be all these billions of people still to inhabit the earth. And I think, whoever you are, you can connect with that kind of idea of the future. Or you can pick up a book by a sci-fi writer like Kim Stanley Robinson, who's just written a brilliant book called The Ministry for the Future, all about how we're going to deal with the climate crisis. And that can transport you whether you've got kids or not. So, let's hear it for the human imagination, actually, our capacity to leap forward in time.
Well, I can speak for myself. I'm child-free, and I think about the future of all other species. Tigers are probably my favorite. I don't want to think about there ever being a world where there's no tigers or lions or any other amazing species for everybody else to enjoy and just for them to be alive. So that's my motivation. And I think it is the motivation of a lot of other child-free people who choose not to have children.
And in fact, of course, a lot of people who choose not to have children are the most committed to long-term thinking and intergenerational justice, because that's why they do it, right?
Right? Whether it be personal reasons or for the planet. Yeah, exactly. I like sleep.
Good point. Good point. But I was going to say, I think clearly she's not qualified to run for political office, though, is she?
No, definitely not, for more reasons than one.
I'm thinking there's got to be something in the atmosphere in Washington, D.C. and a few other places around the world that makes it impossible to do legacy thinking. I mean, do we need to do a spoiler? Are we keeping the listeners guessing a little bit about what the bottom line is? What makes you a good ancestor? Do we need to save that to the end, or should we go for that?
Let's get into it right now. What actually is a good ancestor? Is there a secret to all of this? I don't know. Well, actually, I do have an answer to that question in a sense. I mean, look, I'm not someone who believes in kind of silver bullet magic solutions to the world's problems. I don't think universal basic income or a carbon tax or whatever it is going to solve all our problems for us. But I learned something really interesting when doing the research for this book, which is a kind of a secret to being a good ancestor. And, while I was doing all this research, I was thinking a lot about how do we extend our time horizons? How do we think forward, not just on the scale of seconds, minutes, or hours, but on a scale of decades, centuries, or millennia? That's what the great immunologist Jonas Salk asked us to do. He was the guy who discovered the polio vaccine, and he said the big question about time is, are we being good ancestors? So he thought we need to extend our minds forward. But one of the things I learned really interesting was from the biomimicry designer and thinker Janine Benyus. And if your listeners don't know her, look her up. Her surname is spelled Benyus. And she is all about thinking about how do we learn from nature? How do we learn from the 3.8 billion years of R&D that nature has to offer? And one of the things she says is that if you ask yourself, how have other species survived for the long term? For 10,000 generations or more? And her answer is this. It's by taking care of the place that will take care of their offspring. In other words, by not damaging the ecosystem in which they're embedded, by not fouling the nest. It sounds very obvious, right? But that's how birds, beavers, bears, whatever, survive. They're not going to be around in 1,000 or 10,000 generations to care for their offspring, so they take care of the place, which is the opposite of what humans have been doing with ever-increasing speed at scale for the last century or so. We are experts at fouling the nest and going up the curve of the great acceleration. And so that tells us the secret, because then the secret to being a long-term thinker isn't necessarily about expanding our sense of time, but it's about reconnecting with place, right? It's about living within the ecological boundaries. It's about falling in love with ice sheets and savannas and rivers and meadows. There's a beautiful Mohawk blessing. Thank you, Earth. You know the way. The essence, I think, of long-term thinking is in that sense of place. But then that raises itself huge questions about, okay, well, what kind of economic models are appropriate for living within the boundaries of the ecosystem? And of course, there's lots of interesting examples out there. The circular economy movement, well-being movements, donor economics, all sorts of things. But
Gee, how come you know so much about that?
Well, this is my disclaimer that my partner happens to be the inventor of one of these models of economic thinking, the donut of social and planetary boundaries, Kate Rayworth. And
the hottest economist on the planet right now, I'd say.
She was even endorsed by the Pope the other day. He's now a fan of donor economics, as well as the British equivalent of the Pope, which is the naturalist David Attenborough, who's kind of seen as a god for his TV programs about nature. And he's put a whole chapter in his latest book about donor economics. And actually, from Kate, I've re-educated myself. I studied economics a bit about 30 years ago, but I never studied ecological economics, which is that economics about living within the boundaries, going back to the great work of people like Herman Daly, which is telling us something that seems so blindingly obvious, which is don't use more resources than the planet can naturally regenerate, and don't create more waste that it can naturally absorb. But when I studied economics, I just got the demand and supply diagram on a white background without a circle of the biosphere around it. But I started learning about that when I was 45. God, that's pathetic, isn't it? But at least now I know something about the importance of place.
Well, that's what frustrated Kate, I think, and got her headed in the direction she's going. And I want you to please say hello to her for me. I don't know whether she mentioned it to you, but I interviewed her. Erika, I think, I interviewed her for the Conversation Earth radio series a few years ago. And in fact, it was such a good interview, it ended up being 2 parts, 2 different episodes. So longtime fan of Kate. Pretty cool that you have that connection.
I will send on the message to her.
Thanks. She's a star like Greta Thunberg is a star, a couple of truth tellers out there.
Well, it's really interesting, for example, not long ago, the Biden Treasury transition team asked her to present the donut. And I thought, that's an interesting sign of the times. That's not the only example, but there's a kind of energy around post-growth economics.
Finally.
Which is really remarkable.
Yeah.
I have a question. You say in the book that we need a Future Generations Act. What does that entail?
So, not far from where I live, in Wales, which is a couple of hours from where I live actually, they have an amazing political position. It's called the Future Generations Commissioner. So it's a public position, and the job of the commissioner is to look at the impacts of Welsh government policy on future generations going about 30 years into the future. So whether it's environmental policy, transport, healthcare, education, employment, everything. And that position came out of a piece of legislation called the Wellbeing for Future Generations Act, which they passed in Wales. And it's really remarkable because there is someone dedicated to future generations, a political position. Now, the Future Generations Commissioner herself, her name's Sophie Howe, a wonderful person. She will admit to you that she doesn't have as much power as she'd really like. But that is being remedied in the sense that right now in the UK, there is a bill before Parliament for the whole UK to have a Future Generations Commissioner that has even more powers, like the powers to legally take to court government departments for failing to meet targets, whether it's on carbon emissions or child poverty, things like that. It's also got another key element, which is a citizens' assembly element, an element of participatory democracy, where the commissioner will not be like a platonic guardian presiding over the country's future generations, but whose views will be informed by everyday citizens about the kind of long-term issues and thinking that matter to them. So I think the idea of a Future Generations Act, a piece of legislation with a political position, is one fundamental way of kind of injecting long-termism into democratic processes. Because you can have all the sustainable development goals that you like, but if your politics is still incredibly short-term in its cycles, you're not going to get very far. Now, I'm not saying that, say, for the US, a Future Generations Commissioner is the right way to go necessarily, because there may be other approaches that maybe should be prioritized. So for example, in the US, there's the public interest law firm Our Children's Trust, who's taken a legal route to filing a landmark case on behalf of 21 young people, the Juliana 21, against the federal government, also against state government, and these young people are campaigning for the legal right to a safe climate and healthy atmosphere for both current and future generations. Now, I think this is one of the most exciting developments in human rights since the French Revolution. Rights to people who may not be born for decades. Maybe you think I'm exaggerating, but actually it's a really amazing idea. And Our Children's Trust has influenced legal cases around the world, in the Netherlands, in Colombia, in Uganda. So I think there's a legal route, also to injecting more long-termism into the democratic process. Actually, I think we need multiple approaches, as always with these things.
We would benefit greatly from having somebody at the table when some of these big policy discussions are happening in the White House here in the U.S.
Maybe you don't actually even need anyone at the actual table. I know some companies at their board meetings, they leave an empty chair. And that empty chair is future generations, right? And this is kind of goes back to a Native American idea of the children's fire, that's there to symbolize the people who aren't in the room, those generations to come. Or in fact, there's a company I came across the other day, a UK renewable energy company called Good Energy, and they've just appointed a children's board. So teenagers who's a kind of a parallel to the main board who are there to monitor it. Now, I don't know how much real power they're going to have, but it's another way of bringing the voice of the future into the room, changing the conversation.
That's amazing.
I know, isn't that cool?
Yeah.
But, in fact, here's another cool thing. I've got a conversation scheduled with the Minister for the Future from the United Arab Emirates. So the UAE, they have a ministerial post, right, dedicated to the future. Now, hopefully it's to get them off fossil fuels, but I'll see what happens when I speak to her. I don't even, in fact, know what she really wants to talk about. She read my book, wants to chat. Great, I'll talk to her. But look, there's all sorts of innovation in this area. These are all the time rebels of the world who are dedicated to long-term thinking and intergenerational justice, a kind of secret movement that we don't really know about.
I just have to interject something here about American exceptionalism, because Erika and I do live in the United States, and so we are kind of bombarded with that notion, and we certainly have been for the last 4 years. And you're giving us so many examples of how the U.S. seems to be bringing up the rear.
Yeah, and, who knows how much they're going to take on board. I mean, I think when I look at the US, where I see hope, and, I used to live in the US a long time ago in Western Massachusetts, so it's a long time since I've been really engaged in US politics and things, but certainly where I see hope is at the city level, and I think the symbolic aspect of that, or example of that, is, when Trump pulled out of the Paris Agreement and 279 US mayors said, no, we're going to stick to this. They represented 1 in 5 Americans, and from big cities too, Miami, Boston, and so on. It doesn't mean it's easy to decarbonize a city. I'm not going to pretend that's the case, but I think, historically, taking the long view, which is what I like to do, writing about long-term thinking, cities are actually really good at dealing with long-term issues historically. And, it was cities in ancient Rome that introduced the first, public health, sewers and public baths, aqueducts, stuff like that. It was the public works projects in cities in the 19th century in Paris and London which introduced sewage systems which are still in use today. So I think it's partly because cities are often close to the action of having to deal with problems of flooding, of social conflicts over resources, migration. They become schools of tolerance in many ways, as well, of course, schools of discrimination too. But I'd sort of bet on cities over the next 100 years to really take us forward.
Yeah, but maybe there is hope. I can't believe that the Biden administration actually reached out to Kate Raworth to talk about donut economics.
I think it's a good time to move on to good conversations to have with anybody who's feeling a little resistant about saving for the future. I mean, when we're talking about the planet, I look at it as just a savings account. And I was raised to save for the future, even if that means I don't know how long I'll be alive. Why can't I just spend all my money today? Yeah. How do I know I'm going to be alive for tomorrow? There's this whole, you only live once idea here that's pretty popular, especially among younger people. But I don't really have that. I'm a saver. I save, and that's easy for me. But I guess just for anybody who's resistant, what are some things that you might do to start the conversation with them?
I guess the starting point might be a quote from Groucho Marx, who apparently once said, "Why should I care about future generations? What have they ever done for me?" Which I think is brilliant.
It's a good point.
It's great because it really taps into something a lot of people intuitively feel, right? Hell, I've got enough problems in my life. I just lost my job. I'm in the middle of a global pandemic. My daughter's ill, whatever. I'm a refugee. I'm just trying to deal with the here and now. Why should I care? And I always think, a bit of humor is quite a good way of talking to climate deniers or whoever it happens to be. But I also think a little bit of historical perspective. I heard this great talk by, what's her name? Catherine Hayhoe, the climate activist, who's from a religious background. I think she's a Baptist. I might be wrong about that. But I remember her talking about how she speaks to climate deniers. Like if she's at a conference speaking to people from the coal industry. And look, I might be paraphrasing her or quoting her completely wrongly, but I seem to remember her saying something like this. She said something like, if I'm talking to people from the coal or oil industry or the frackers, I go in there and the first thing I say is, I love fossil fuels. And I love fossil fuels because over the last couple of 100 years, they have brought us amazing things. They have brought us human longevity and education and great holidays and air conditioning, all sorts of things. But we now know too much. In the 19th century, the fossil fuel industrialists didn't know about the impacts that they were having. But now we know, so we don't have any excuse. So, okay, let's accept the great things that the fossil fuels have brought us, in the post-Enlightenment era, in the industrial era. Mm-hmm. But now let's move on, okay? Let's move on. And I think that's a wonderful kind of way of thinking, because in a way it's tapping into something I write about in my book, which is the idea of the legacies that we leave. And if you think about it, we've inherited some very positive legacies from the past, like, the medical discoveries we've been bequeathed. And yes, let's pass those on to the future. But we've also been, we've inherited very negative legacies too, legacies of racism, colonialism, slavery, which create deep inequities that must now be, challenged, or legacies of economies which are structurally addicted to fossil fuels and endless growth that must now be transformed. So there's a little bit of an intergenerational golden rule thing going on here. Most religions or ethical systems have some kind of golden rule idea: do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. But let's extend that through time. Let's do unto future generations how we like them to have done to us. So in a way, going back to your question, Erika, and sorry for this slightly long answer because it was just a really interesting question. If you're talking to people who don't really want to listen, about future generations and, sustainability issues, climate change, actually, literally just by talking about the golden rule, do unto others you'd have them do unto you, is one way in. Talking to them about the kind of world that their kids or grandkids might inherit if they have children, without having to tell them what your politics is. One of the things I found really fascinating about talking about this book to politicians is that you can talk to people of the left and right, the center. They all get the idea of the legacies that they're going to leave. On some level, they care. Now, some of them are like Russian oligarchs who want to be remembered for having a football stadium named after them. But actually, most people care about family, and that is a bridge. And it's very profound, especially if you're having one-on-one conversations, very profound way of then getting to some of those larger issues about, ecological stewardship, for example. You don't have to go in first with the climate stats about rising sea levels.
So finding common ground.
Yeah, it is about finding common ground. And, I used to run this crazy community project called the Oxford Muse, spelled M-U-S-E. And it was a project to create conversations between strangers. So we'd invite like 100 CEOs and 100 people who live on the street, or young and old, or people from different religions. And what we'd do, we'd invite them for a meal. But instead of giving them a menu of food, we gave them a menu of conversation with questions about life on it. Like, what have you learned about the different varieties of love in your life? Or in what ways would you like to be more courageous? And it was about creating common ground before you then go on to the tougher discussions about, weaning ourselves off our fossil fuel economy or whatever it happens to be, or I'm from this religion, I don't like your religion, what are we going to do? But you find the common ground, and I think that is really essential in taking people on these journeys.
I love that so much. Yeah. Especially because there is so much division right now. Because of that, I find that people are avoidant of very hard conversations like this. And so I don't think that that is effective at all. It is a hard conversation. None of this is easy. And I don't think you would have written a book if it was easy. It's really hard work. But I think that is the first step, is actually having a conversation and being able to acknowledge that we all care about different things, but there is common ground. A lot of us do care about family, or a lot of us do care about something in the future, whether it be the tigers, the bears, or just the sky outside and it not going to flames.
Yeah, I mean, I think, though, at the same time as having those one-to-one conversations, we need to recognize the urgency of the ecological challenges, and that means collective action, is required. And, but that, of course, can take many forms. It can be supporting a legal organization like Our Children's Trust. It could be locking yourself into the offices of a fossil fuel economy, or sticking yourself to their lovely glass panels, whatever way you want to do it, because we all have different, I guess, motivations and energies. Some people are more introspective and want to write books, like me. Friends of mine, they're the people that want to lock themselves on. Great, we need direct action too. So you've got to go where your own energy takes you, but those collective actions are required. But I really do believe in the power of conversation. I think this is been a fundamental part of the human story. It's been part of the story about challenging racism, about women's rights. I mean, all sorts of things. It's about, saying things you've never said before, opening up those tougher discussions.
100%.
So I want to maybe go off on a little bit of a tangent.
I love your tangents, Dave. They're great.
Yeah, they're striking gold every time we do that. And you're a philosopher, and I know you've thought about this. So I have this theory. We're seeing today here in the United States, we're seeing Republican senators who don't seem to be motivated by the desire to do the right thing. They're more concerned about what's going to happen in the next election. And I'm trying not to make this a big political conversation, but that's one example. Doing the right thing actually doesn't seem to be a part of the public conversation as much today as I think it used to be. My theory is that economists have been telling us for so long that we're self-interested, that we have just been ratcheting the bar down and we expect a lot less of ourselves now than we used to. And it seems to me that being a good ancestor requires you to get in touch with the angels of your better nature, to do the right thing instead of the self-interested thing. What's your opinion? Do you think my theory has any validity, that we've been taught to expect less of ourselves, largely by the economic story we've been given?
I absolutely agree with you. I think that story about the self-interested individual has been challenged in economics since the 1970s, when the great economist Amartya Sen wrote a famous article called Rational Fools. But it takes a long time for the economics departments to change their thinking, right? And the consequence, of course, of that idea of the rational, self-interested economic man, so he is called, with a he, not a she, has been absolutely enormous. It affects our education institutions, which are designed around competition rather than collaboration. And if you think about the neoliberal ideology that was emerging, from the 1970s, out of the Chicago School and so on, all based on the idea of the rational economic individual, that ideology is one without a sense of time, going forward in time. It's about deregulating the markets now. It's about supply and demand now. It's not about a connection with future generations. And I think this is a slightly technical subject, but I think it's really important, which is the subject of discounting, or economic discounting. One of the big problems with economics and the way decision-making, especially long-term investments, are made by not just companies but governments, is they follow an economic logic, which is called discounting, where basically you put less weight on the interests of people the further and further they are forward in time. In the same way that as people walk further and further away from you, the smaller and smaller they get. So what happens is you front load the interests of the people of today. And that might mean you don't invest in something like a tidal energy power scheme, because the benefits are going to accrue 50, 60 years down the road. They're not included in the economic calculus. So I totally agree with you that the economics profession has a lot to answer for there. And what that really means is that changing our education systems is absolutely fundamental. We need to bring the we as well as the me into the way that children are taught and college students are taught when they do Econ 101. But let's think of it across, the realm, and not just think about teaching both the me and the we, the individual and the collective, but also the short and the long. We aren't just short-term creatures. We need to start thinking long-term. And then, the David Suzuki Foundation in Canada, for example, has created some really good educational materials based on the idea of seventh-generation decision-making. And one of the things that they do, I was looking at their curriculum the other day, is they get the kids, I think probably elementary school kids, to look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which has nothing about future generations in it, and to write a new article of the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights that is specifically about caring about future generations. So it's trying to put into practice that seventh generation idea. So that too is a kind of combo. It's about the collective, getting off rational economic man, but it's also introducing the key dimension of time into things, because it's not enough just to think about the here and now. We must think beyond our own lifetimes.
I think that's a good place to end, and maybe go on to, we have a game that we play at the end of every episode. And I don't know, Dave, did you have anything to add before we?
Only that we could do another whole episode. And it's such a pleasure to talk to somebody who's so smart, so thoughtful, so well informed. So I hope we might be able to just schedule another conversation in 6 months or something like that.
Let's do it. The guy who I used to work with at the place called the Oxford Muse, where we have all the conversations, he used to say that, conversations don't really get going for the first 2 or 3 hours. Then they start getting really interesting. So yeah, of course, let's keep going whenever we can. But the game, Erika, tell me.
Well, we call it Honey, I Shrunk My Footprint, right?
Yeah. And I think you're better at introducing the game, Dave.
Okay. The deal is that we each share something that we have recently done or that we're doing or we do all the time. It can vary, that we do in order to walk a little more lightly on the planet. Sometimes it's fun to come up with something surprising or quirky. Sometimes it's just really mainstream. And if there's something that you are particularly proud of in that realm, this would be a great chance. We'd love to hear it. But also if you have a rant, if there's something you do that it seems like nobody else does, why don't they do that? Then you can have a rant about it. So the rules are pretty broad, but we each just share one thing that we do that we think is kind of noteworthy.
Can I share 3 things?
Yeah.
That's great.
So, yes, there's 3 things I'd like to talk about in response to this lovely game of yours. The first thing that I've recently done, my partner and I, we decided to get rid of our fossil fuel car, which we've had for 14 years, and we've joined the local electric car club. And so there are lots of electric cars around where we live. There's one about 100 meters away. And, we still love our bicycles best. We can cycle around our city. But now we've got rid of this big hunk of metal. And the great challenge we've got now is to stop our evil carbon twins just coming to park their car in front of our house, whoever they may be. So we've started doing artworks on the pavement, on the street, like drawing with chalk, been drawing giant donuts and sigmoid curves and the kind of stuff that we are weirdly into. So that's one thing I've done, is let go of the car. And that's quite tough, actually, because we've got 12-year-old twins. They want to be taken to football practices and hockey matches on the weekend. So that's going to be a little bit tougher, but it's liberating ultimately.
Bravo. Yeah. Good for you. And is the artwork actually working? People are reluctant to park on top of it?
No one has parked there since, but it's only been a couple of weeks.
Wow.
And we keep having to renew it because the rain washes away the chalk. So that's one thing I've done. The other thing I've done, actually, and this has taken me so long to get around to, it's like taking me 3 years, which is to get my money out of a bank which doesn't give a damn, And I've moved my savings and my banking into a Dutch bank called Triodos, which has a very sustainable ethos. It's an ethical bank, sustainable bank. And also, what's interesting about them also is they have shares, but their shares are traded on a private platform, which means they're not subject to the same short-term pressures of the regular stock market. So they've got long-termism built into their financial design. Right? So that's just like, why have I spent years keeping my money in a bank who, pretends to be a bit ethical by not investing in, military hardware and tobacco, but apart from that, they don't really do very much for future generations. And I guess the third thing, which is probably a little bit more quirky, which is not directly about shrinking my carbon footprint, but I recently turned 50, and my present to myself on my 50th birthday was to force my children and my wife to go on a bicycle ride with me. About 5 minutes from our house, there's a tree which is in a churchyard, and the tree is about 1,000 years old. It's an ancient yew tree. And we climbed up into the tree and had a picnic up there for my 50th birthday. Of course, that wasn't directly reducing the carbon footprint, even though we went by bicycle, but it was about getting in touch with a deeper sense of time, because that yew tree was there during the English Civil War in the 17th century, or when the Black Death scourged Europe in the 14th century, and it will be long after I am dead and my children are dead, probably. And that kind of act, that kind of ritual, let's say, gives you a bit of a sense of humility, because it helps reinforce that idea I think we're familiar with, that humankind is just an eye blink in the cosmic story, and what arrogance is it to think that in just our couple of 100 years since the Industrial Revolution that we have the right to trash the planet, colonize the planet with our ecological damage and technological risks, and break the chain of life. So a little bit of a visit to a yew tree, I think, can be a sort of tangential way of shrinking that carbon footprint, in a way changing the kind of mindset that we have, because ultimately the most profound changes in society come from changing the way we think about the world, realizing that it's the earth that goes around the sun and not the other way around, realizing that humans are not separate from nature, realizing that men and women are equal. These paradigm shifts are really fundamental. So let's now shift to the age of the good ancestor.
Damn, Erika. How do we follow that?
I know. I want to hear more about number 2, the banks. That's like not something I've ever thought about. So if you have any recommendations for our listeners or for me, I want to read more about that. That sounds really cool.
Yeah, I don't know enough about it in the US context and whether this Dutch bank, for example, Triodos, it's worth just looking up what they do. You've probably got community banks and things around you, alternative ways of, saving your money and also spending your money, of course, and with alternative currency schemes as well. But the banking thing is potentially revolutionary.
It's awesome.
Yeah. All right, Erika, you want to go next?
Yes, I'm going to go next. This past year, it's been a big year. I sold my car last summer, so I've been car-free for a while now.
In Los Angeles.
Well, I'm in Orange County. It's about an hour away from Los Angeles, but...
That's all Los Angeles.
Yeah, my friends are sort of amazed how I'm able to do it for this long. It's really not that hard. I think the pandemic makes it a lot easier. But more recently, I would say that I want to start reading a book now every month. And that means that I need to pay more attention to where I'm buying my books. So I'm not going to go on Amazon Prime and just buy from Amazon Prime like I, might have used to do. So I have been looking at used bookstores and trying to find just used books or asking friends to lend me their books. So it's been kind of a fun thing. I have a couple friends of mine who are really avid readers, and I've kind of fallen off in the past few months. So I'm trying to get more into that, and just kind of a book exchange has been what I've been focusing on. So that's mine.
Very good. Good for you. Yeah. Okay, so mine, real quickly. Episode 52 of the GrowthBusters podcast was shrinking your travel footprint. And one of the things that we learned was that if you have to fly and you book an itinerary that is somewhat indirect, which happens frequently in the United States because we've got the hub and spoke system, and it's inevitably cheaper to not take a direct flight, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense economically. But your carbon footprint could be 3 times or more the footprint of flying direct. And I actually had to book some air travel. I have to confess that. And I was using airline miles. It was for a family vacation. And the itinerary that would use the fewest miles, I'm pretty frugal, so that was what I looked at first. It was going to take me, I think it was about 2,000-mile round trip out of my way, but less miles. I'd have to use more of my miles to take a direct flight. But I said to myself, geez, Dave, walk the talk here. And so I spent the miles. And of course, the bonus is I don't have to spend a whole day sitting in a cattle car airplane crisscrossing the country. I'll spend a lot less time flying, but I was pretty proud of myself for spending more, in this case, just airline miles, in order to have a smaller footprint. Wow, Roman, I just want to say, what a great conversation. If I lived down the street, I'd be over at your house for happy hour every day just so that we could have that 3-hour conversation.
Well, I've just been perfecting making a martini, so anytime you're around in Oxford, England, not Oxford, Mississippi, drop on by.
I'll make sure it's a direct flight.
Yeah. Well, thanks to you both. I've been saying things I haven't said before, and that's always a sign of a good conversation.
Thank you so much, Roman. This has been wonderful.
Well, reluctantly, this brings us to the end of another episode of the GrowthBusters podcast. But don't forget to explore these issues further at growthbusters.org. Really a delight talking with Roman. Erika, thanks so much for arranging that. And we'll put a link in the show notes where you can acquire that book responsibly.
And as always, you can find us at growthbusters.org and search for GrowthBusters Podcast on Facebook, Spotify, and your smart speaker.
Yeah, and don't forget to subscribe to this podcast if you think it's important, because it doesn't cost you any money to subscribe and recommend it to your friends.
I'm Erika Arias, reminding you that friends don't let friends miss the real story on sustainable living. Thanks so much for listening.
Yeah, thank you to all of our listeners for offering your support and for allowing us to do this very meaningful work.
Some may dream to pave mountains and streams, but not me. I'm a growth buster. Some may just want more, but don't know what it's for, but not me. I'm a growth buster. Don't want a solution at the cost of pollution. They think bigger is better at the cost of the weather. But no, not us. We are the growth busters. Calling, 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 calling. Call the growth busters.